Alright, in this video I will show you how to make a vertex edge graph, and I will show you how to represent a vertex edge graph as in matrix form. So, looking at number 12, part A. Each one of these states will be represented by a vertex on my vertex edge graph. So I see I have 5 states, so I will have 5 vertices. Alright, I'll just use a single letter. So this is Colorado, Nebraska, Iowa, this is Montana, or is that Missouri? That's Missouri, and Kansas. We are supposed to draw a vertex edge graph to represent the portion of the United States. Let each state be represented by a vertex, then draw an edge between 2 vertices if the states share a border. So Colorado shares a border with Nebraska, and it also shares a border with Kansas. Nebraska, in addition to sharing a border with Colorado, it also shares a border with Kansas, and it shares a border with Iowa. Oh, and I can see it's a little bit here, it's touching Missouri. So it does share a border with Missouri. All right, how about Iowa? Of course, Iowa shares a border with Nebraska. It does not quite touch Kansas, but it shares a border with Missouri. Missouri shares a border with Iowa. It shares a border with Nebraska. Already have those. But it also shares a border with Kansas. So this would be a vertex edge graph representing which states share borders. Now, we could represent that same information from the vertex edge graph in matrix form in the following way. Let's label across the top with letters representing the states. I put mine in alphabetical order. And do the same thing down the side. So we will put a 1 if the state shares a border with another state. So for example, this square right here is shared by Kansas and Iowa. So if Kansas shares a border with Iowa, we'll put a 1 here. If it doesn't, we'll put a 0. So Kansas and Iowa do not share a border. So there will be a 0 there. And that will be duplicated. So this is Kansas, Iowa. How about Iowa, Kansas? Okay, that's going to be the same thing. So each one of these will have a mirror image. Now, this diagonal right down the middle would mean that Colorado shares a border with itself, or Iowa shares a border with Iowa. It's impossible for a state to border itself, so there will be zeros all the way down the diagonal for sure. Okay, so let's start with Iowa. Looking at the vertex edge graph, Iowa shares a border with Nebraska and Montana. All right, so Iowa shares a border with, did I say Montana? Again, this is Missouri. Montana is like way up north. Sorry. So Iowa shares a border with Missouri and Nebraska. Okay, so Missouri gets a 1 and Nebraska gets a 1. Okay, and we'll do it the other way as well. Iowa shares a border with Missouri and Nebraska. All right, always mirror images of each other. Okay, and of course it did not share a border with Colorado. So that's what these zeros represent. Okay, let's move on to Kansas. Kansas shares a border with Colorado, Nebraska, and Missouri. Okay, Colorado, Nebraska, and Missouri. Okay, so here's Colorado, Nebraska, and Missouri. All right, now let's move on to Missouri. Missouri shares a border with Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. Okay, Missouri shares a border with Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. Okay, so not this one. Missouri shares a border with Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, but not this one. All right, and finally Nebraska. Nebraska shares a border with all of the other states. Okay, so Nebraska shares a border with all of the other states except for Nebraska. Okay, so this matrix represents the exact same information contained in the vertex edge graph. All right, let's call this matrix S. Okay, to answer part C, you need to understand one more thing about a matrix form of a vertex edge graph. Okay, the matrix itself raised to any power, okay? Every element inside the matrix, all these zeros and ones in this case, represents the number of ways you can do something. And the exponent represents the number of times. So for example, this matrix is just matrix S. So you can think of it as S to the 1 power. So every number on here represents the number of ways you can go from one state to another, crossing a border one time. Okay? So if I were to calculate the new matrix S to the 4th power, each element would represent the number of ways you can get from one state to another, crossing a border 4 times. All right, so the exponent is all about how many times you can do something. If it's S to the 1 power, it's how many ways you can cross one border. If it's S to the 4th power, like this, then it's the number of ways you can get from state to state crossing 4 borders. If it was to the 5th power, it'd be the number of ways you can get from state to state crossing 5 borders. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this video. Go ahead and click here in the red apple to watch the next video. Click in the green apple to subscribe, or click the yellow apple for the full playlist.